The door to the royal archive doesn't creak in the stories. It thuds, wood on stone, because a guard is pushing it shut with his shoulder while someone outside is still shouting for orders. Inside, oil lamps breathe smoke into the rafters. A scribe's stylus scratches damp clay. Akkadian signs bite into the tablet, wedge by wedge, because Akkadian is what great powers use when they need the other side to understand every clause. This is not literature. This is a weapon you can carry without a chariot. And tonight, both empires are scared enough to sign it. I want you to feel the room the way I feel it when I hold the evidence in my mind like a warm stone. Clay is heavier than paper. It keeps the pressure of a thumb. It remembers the tremor in a wrist. On this tablet, found centuries later in the Hittite capital at Hattusa, in the ruins of Bagazkoi, peace isn't a poem. It is a set of restraints snapped onto two kings who can't afford another season of dust and arrows. But here's the puzzle that keeps historians awake. If the Battle of Kadesh was a victory, if one side truly won, why does the treaty read like mutual fear, written into stone and clay? Now step outside that archive door for one breath. Leather creaks. Sweat is sharp. Horse breath steams in the cold. A quartermaster is counting grain sacks by lamplight because a chariot team eats like a small village. Messengers stand ready, ankles dusty, each one a living fuse between palaces. And beyond the torchlight, the frontier is restless, Syria, the gateway land, where vassal rulers sleep with a knife near their bed because they don't know whose banner will demand tribute next month. The clock is simple: one raid, one insult, one panicked report from a border fort, and the campaign season ignites again. This case has two principal witnesses, and they disagree in public. Witness 1 is the Hittite tablet version, pressed and stored in an archive, administrative reality, meant to be retrieved, consulted, enforced. Witness 2 is Egyptian, the hieroglyphic versions carved where everyone can see them, on temple walls at Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesses, where diplomacy becomes permanent propaganda, as immovable as the gods' names. Same treaty, different media, different audiences, different kinds of truth. When you have one version in a filing room and another version on a monument, you are not just reading history. You are watching two empires argue over memory itself. The cast is not abstract. Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, who cannot afford the public story of a stalemate because Pharaoh is supposed to be the son's favorite son, the man for whom chaos politely steps aside. Hattusili III of Hatti, a ruler with a more dangerous problem: legitimacy. He took power in a world where royal blood and royal right were never the same thing, and rivals remember every shortcut to the throne. Queen Puduhipa, his partner in rule, a diplomat with religious authority and an instinct for the long game, the kind of mind that can lace a marriage proposal with a strategic trap. And then the people who make empires function: scribes with cramped fingers, messengers with blistered feet, chariot drivers who know that one snapped rein can turn a king into a corpse. Add the border vassals, Amuru and the other client polities in Syria, the dominoes that fall first when a treaty fails. The objective is brutally human: stop the war from restarting, stop allies from defecting, and do it without admitting weakness. So let's open the file. Most chronologies place the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, fought near the Orontes River, close to the fortress city of Kadesh, one of those places that looks like a dot on a map until you realize it is a gate. Control Kadesh, and you can lean on the roads and river crossings that connect north and south, coast and interior. It is not a romantic battlefield. It is a choke point with walls. And roughly 15 years later, commonly cited around 1259 BC, with scholarly debates about regnal year synchronizations, Egypt and Hatti sign what we call the Treaty of Kadesh. Two dates, one question: what happened in the interval that made clauses more attractive than chariots? We have to treat Kadesh not as a single afternoon of heroics, but as a logistic story with blood in its margins. Egypt's army marched in divisions named for gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, Seth, moving in separated columns. That structure buys you speed and command clarity, but it also buys you distance between units, and distance is vulnerability with a countdown attached. The Hittites understood concentration. They understood deception. Ancient war is often decided before the first arrow by what scouts report, what messengers distort, what a commander thinks is true when it isn't. Egyptian accounts include a famous episode: the Shasu, nomads, captured and questioned, feeding misinformation that the Hittite king is far away. You can almost see the moment a confident decision hardens into a mistake. Picture it, the air is dry enough to crack lips. The ground near the Orontes is trampled, and the river itself is a kind of cruel friend, an obstacle if you need to cross quickly, a barrier if you need protection. Kadesh sits there, fortress still, a stone anchor. This is important, the prize is not the field. The prize is the network, who controls the city, the roads, the vassals, the flow of tribute and grain. A battlefield trophy is useless if the next season every local ruler switches sides. Now, the chariots. You've heard the simplified version, fast Egyptian two-man chariots, heavier Hittite multi-man chariots. But here the evidence gets slippery, and the arguments matter. Some reconstructions emphasize Egyptian maneuver and archery, two-man teams optimized for speed and shooting, while casting Hittite chariots as heavier shock platforms, perhaps carrying more crew for close combat and momentum. Numbers and exact configurations are debated, and ancient boasts inflate like bellows. But what is not debated is the basic physics of it. Chariots are expensive machines. They require wood, bronze fittings, leather, skilled craftsmen, and above all horses that must be fed, watered, rested, protected from disease. Every chariot on the field is an investment, and every broken axle is a fiscal wound. Here is the decisive minute that Egyptian sources want you to remember. In the Egyptian poem and bulletin, Ramesses rides into catastrophe. His forward elements are isolated. The Hittite attack crashes into the Egyptian camp like a door kicked in at dawn. Dust blinds. Tents collapse. Men shout God's names the way drowning men shout for air. And then, according to Egypt's own telling, Ramesses stands alone, a king against the swarm, personally stabilizing the situation until reinforcements arrive. It is cinematic, almost too perfect, the divine king abandoned by men, saved by his own courage and the favor of Amun. But if we're doing forensic history, we have to ask what alone really means. The motif of the solitary hero king is not an accident, it is a structured claim, a piece of royal ideology you could carve into stone and sell to eternity. The more likely reality is messier, reconnaissance failure, misinformation success, spacing between divisions exploited with lethal timing. Alone can also mean out of position, out of communication, ahead of his support. So the first major conflict of perspectives lands right here. Egyptian perspective, the king's valor turned defeat into victory. Critical perspective, the king's army blundered into an ambush and survived by improvisation, luck, and late arriving support. And then there's a third perspective that often gets lost because it's less dramatic, the possibility that both things are partially true. A commander can be courageous and still misinformed. A system can fail and still recover. A battle can end in tactical ambiguity while producing strategic consequences that neither side can easily advertise. This is the first taste of what I call stalemate alchemy, turning an outcome that doesn't satisfy into a story that does. So why didn't the war end after Kadesh? Because a battlefield is not the same thing as control. Even if you accept the Egyptian narrative of heroism, survival is not conquest. The strategic objective in Syria wasn't to win applause, it was to lock down a client network, cities, rulers, supply lines, ports, tribute routes. Vassal politics are brutally pragmatic. Local rulers watch and calculate, who can protect me, who can punish me, who can feed my garrison, whose messengers arrive with gifts instead of threats. In that world, victory is measured by who collects tribute next season, not by who composes the better poem. Consider the attrition. Campaign seasons cost grain. They cost horses. They cost men who might have planted fields, repaired canals, guarded caravans. Border communities become shock absorbers, raided, taxed, conscripted, relocated. Each year of war makes the system more brittle, and brittle systems snap in ways that kings cannot predict. So if you're Ramesses, you might want to freeze the northern frontier and present that freeze as domination. If you're Hattusili, you might want external recognition that makes rivals hesitate. And if you're Pudu-Hepa, you might want a diplomatic architecture that outlives a single campaign and binds the future to your dynasty's paper, clay, trail. Now we come back to the artifact itself, because the treaty text is hard evidence in a way battle narratives are not. A boast can be improvised. A treaty has to be negotiated, translated, copied, stored, and invoked. When a clause exists, it means somebody argued about it. Somebody feared a specific scenario strongly enough to carve words against it. The treaty contains mutual non-aggression, both sides bind themselves not to attack. It contains mutual aid, if a third party attacks, the other shall help. And that clause, right there, screams new threat environment. Why promise help unless you believe you might need it? It is the sound of empires hearing footsteps in the hallway. Many scholars connect this to rising Assyrian pressure in the east, shifting the strategic math for Hatti. Hatti cannot afford to keep bleeding in the west while a sharper power grows in the east. Egypt, meanwhile, cannot keep straining northern garrisons and supply lines indefinitely. Distance turns every loaf of bread into a logistical negotiation. This is not romantic. It is arithmetic. Then there is the clause that makes modern listeners sit up straighter: extradition, the return of fugitives. Runaways must be returned. And the text even promises humane treatment on return. You can read that as moral posturing, a ruler polishing his image. Or you can read it as something colder and more practical, an attempt to reduce defection incentives, to stop the slow bleeding of manpower and skilled labor across borders. Because people are strategic assets. A chariot builder, a metalworker, a literate scribe, those are not interchangeable bodies. In a world where the state is hungry for specialized skill, a single defector can be worth a squad. And then, like the seal on a letter, the treaty summons the gods as witnesses. The gods are listed, invoked, threatened, because there is no international court. There is only reputation, deterrence, and fear of divine sanction. Think about what that means. The compliance system is supernatural because the political system lacks any higher enforcement. If you break the treaty, you don't just risk reprisal, you risk cosmic consequences, at least in the public story. In private, you risk losing allies who believe you cannot be trusted. Now, pause and listen to the arguments that scholars and ancient actors implicitly make about what this treaty really was. First interpretation: a sincere peace to end suffering. Evidence: mutual obligations, attempts to stop cycles of raid and reprisal, provisions that anticipate real human movement, fugitives, defectors, suggesting a lived reality of desperation and flight. In this reading, the treaty is a moral pivot, a recognition that endless war destroys what both sides claim to protect. But here's the counterpoint: diplomatic sincerity is not required for a treaty to function. Stability can be a byproduct of elite survival. A king doesn't need to love peace, he only needs to fear chaos more than he craves glory. Second interpretation: a parity pact forced by exhaustion and new threats. Evidence: the mutual defense clauses and the careful symmetry suggest both sides recognize a rough balance. Neither can deliver a clean knockout. Meanwhile, external pressures, again, often linked to Assyria's growth, make continued rivalry irrational. Egypt and Hatti become, in effect, two wrestlers in the sand who suddenly realize there's a wolf behind them. Counterpoint: even if fear and exhaustion drove the treaty, it still sets a template for state-to-state norms. Institutions can be built from panic. Some of humanity's most durable rules are born not from idealism, but from the need to survive our own habits. Third interpretation: propaganda continuity in a new medium. Evidence: Egypt carves the treaty publicly, wrapping it in the aura of Ramesses' eternal kingship, broadcasting legitimacy to subjects and rivals. Hatti preserves it in an archive, embedding it in administrative machinery, ready to be cited when a vassal wavers or a messenger arrives with excuses. Same deal, different performance. Counterpoint: different media doesn't mean one is fake and the other is real. Public monuments are instruments of rule, archives are instruments of rule. Both are real in the way power is real, felt in taxes, in conscription, in whether your village burns or survives the season. So if Kadesh was a victory, why the treaty? Because victory is a word you use to control your own side. Treaty is a tool you use when controlling the enemy is impossible and controlling your allies is urgent. That is the pivot point where this story stops being about chariots and becomes about legitimacy. Ramesses needs to project that the gods favor him, Hattusili needs to project that other kings recognize him, Puduhipa needs to anchor a dynasty in agreements that outlast a battle's dust. Let me bring you closer to Hattusili for a moment, because his situation explains why an archive tablet matters so much. In the Hittite world, the throne is surrounded by family politics sharp enough to cut iron. Hattusili's legitimacy is contested, meaning there are people with blood claims, supporters, and memories who would gladly frame him as an usurper. In that environment, external recognition is not a luxury, it is armor. A treaty with Egypt, the other great power in the region, is a public certificate: I am the king you must deal with. Every foreign envoy who bows to him helps silence a domestic rival. And Puduhipa, do not reduce her to a footnote. You can feel her mind in the way Hatti plays the long game: correspondence, marriage alliances, religious authority. She operates like an engineer of stability, bolting beams into a house built on fault lines. When later diplomacy includes marriage politics, exchanging royal women, negotiating status, it is not gossip. It is infrastructure. A marriage tie is a treaty clause written in flesh and future children. Now pivot back to Ramesses, because his problem is different and just as dangerous. Pharaoh is supposed to win. Not sometimes. Always. The cosmic order, Ma'at, depends on it. So even if Kadesh was ambiguous, Ramesses cannot package ambiguity for domestic consumption. He has to transmute it into triumph. That is why the poem and bulletin exist in the form they do. That is why temples become billboards of divine endorsement. And that is why the treaty, carved publicly, can be presented not as compromise but as the world acknowledging Egypt's stature. But here's the question that keeps slipping between the ribs: if Ramesses truly crushed Hatti, why promise non-aggression? Why swear mutual aid? Why formalize extradition? Those clauses are not the language of a conqueror dictating terms. They are the language of two systems trying to stop worst-case scenarios from becoming real. Let's talk about those worst-case scenarios, because treaties are fear catalogs. Scenario 1: Frontier Raid Spiral. A vassal city defects. The other empire retaliates. A punitive expedition burns fields. Refugees move. Another city panics and switches sides. Suddenly you are campaigning not because you plan to, but because your map is melting. Scenario 2: A third power attacks. You are already stretched, and now you face a war on two fronts, every commander's nightmare. Scenario 3: Internal legitimacy collapses. A rival claims the gods have withdrawn favor because you failed to protect the border. That kind of rumor kills kings faster than arrows. When you look at it that way, the treaty becomes less about friendship and more about systems management. It is an off-ramp built from clauses. It is a tool to control escalation, to reassure allies, to create predictability where none naturally exists. And predictability is not boring in the ancient world. Predictability is survival. Now, we have to confront a phrase you've probably heard: the First Peace Treaty. It's catchy, and it's partly misleading. This treaty may be the earliest major great power peace preserved substantially on both sides, Hittite in clay, Egyptian on stone, but that is also a survival story. Earlier agreements may have existed and simply didn't survive fire, flood, collapse, or the casual hunger of time. Still, the dual survival matters. When both sides preserve versions, we can compare, cross-examine, and catch the fingerprints of self-interest. And those fingerprints show up in what each side chooses to do with the text. Hatti stores it, like a blade in a sheath, ready for a legal or diplomatic fight. Egypt displays it, like a shield painted with a victory scene, ready for a psychological fight. One is a war room document. The other is a public sermon. But both are aimed at the same target: belief. Now let's return to the battlefield in our minds, not to revel in it, but to understand what it taught them. Kadesh demonstrates a painful truth: chariot brilliance cannot solve coalition politics. A charge can break a line, but it cannot guarantee a vassal's loyalty next winter. A heroic stand can save a camp, but it cannot feed horses through a long supply chain. Tactical outcomes don't automatically translate into strategic control. That recognition, slow, reluctant, undeniable, is the turning point. So the war migrates from wheels and arrows to clauses and oaths. And once war becomes paperwork, it doesn't become gentler. It becomes quieter. The cost shifts. Soldiers and drivers pay in repeated campaign seasons, in horses dying from overuse, in injuries that never fully heal. Border communities pay in raids, taxes, forced labor, the constant fear that a messenger will arrive with the wrong seal. Vassal cities pay in forced loyalty shifts, tribute demands, and punitive expeditions designed to make an example out of human beings. And truth itself pays a price. The battle becomes a contested narrative battlefield, stone inscriptions versus archival tablets, teaching us that history is often a negotiated settlement. Let's take a closer look at the Egyptian story machine, because it's not just vanity, it's policy. When Ramesses carves his version of Kadesh into temples, he is not merely boasting. He is instructing governors, priests, and soldiers what to believe about the state's strength. Belief influences whether taxes are paid, whether levies are raised, whether a commander holds his nerve when reports come in from the north. A public narrative of strength can deter opportunistic rebellion. In that sense, propaganda is a form of defense spending. Now look at the Hittite approach. A tablet in an archive is not meant to be admired by crowds. It is meant to be cited. It is meant to be retrieved when a border governor argues, when an envoy claims confusion, when a vassal pleads ignorance. This is bureaucracy as strategy. And it reveals something. Hatti expects disputes. They expect the treaty to be used, interpreted, weaponized in meetings. The archive is a battlefield where words do the stabbing. Here's another question that tightens the story. Why include the humane treatment promise for returned fugitives? If you're simply flexing state power, why bother sounding merciful? One answer is image. Kings want to be seen as just, because justice is a claim to divine favor. Another answer is practical. Cruelty creates martyrs and encourages flight. Mercy can reduce resistance. And there's a third, darker answer. Mercy can be performative, a clause designed to make extradition easier to sell, to lower the moral resistance of the other side when they hand over human beings. Even in the Bronze Age, you can see the beginnings of an old pattern, states wrapping coercion in moral language to make it portable. Now, I can hear an objection forming in your mind. If both sides were afraid, why didn't someone just keep fighting until one broke? Because breaking an empire is not like breaking a spear. It takes time, and time is not neutral. While you fight one enemy, your allies drift, your rivals grow, your internal factions sharpen their knives, your resources thin. The longer a war drags, the more opportunities the world has to change around you. And the Bronze Age world changes fast when trade routes shift and harvests fail. So, in that archive room, with clay still damp, the treaty becomes a second kind of victory. Not victory over the other side in battle, but victory over uncertainty. Victory over the terrifying possibility that next spring will bring another ambush, another near collapse, another wave of refugees, another round of tribute renegotiations. Stalemate alchemy. When neither side can win cleanly, leaders convert battlefield ambiguity into political capital by writing a future so binding it becomes a weapon. But don't mistake binding for guaranteed. The gods are witnesses because the gods are leverage, but leverage is not certainty. Treaties in this era work because breaking them is costly, not just spiritually, but diplomatically. If you become known as a breaker of oaths, you lose allies. Vassals hedge. Neutrals arm. Traders reroute. Reputation is an economy. The treaty is an attempt to stabilize that economy when the currency, trust, is scarce. Now let's stage the debate more sharply, because the tension is the point. Was Kadesh a victory? Egypt says yes, loudly. Hatti does not need to say no loudly. Hatti only needs to still exist, still hold key ground, still command vassals. If Egypt truly won, why is Kadesh not simply absorbed, its gates bearing the pharaoh's cartouche as permanent fact? If Hatti truly won, why negotiate with a king they supposedly humiliated? The treaty itself is the answer. Neither side achieved the kind of dominance that ends arguments. And that creates a human problem. Leaders must manage disappointment. Soldiers want to believe their suffering purchased something permanent. Priests want to believe their gods are not compromised. Nobles want to believe their taxes are not funding a treadmill. So the settlement must be framed not as we couldn't win, but as we chose a higher, wiser path, or we forced them to agree. That's why Egypt's version on temple walls matters so much. A treaty can end a war and still be sold as a triumph. Let's not forget the people who rarely get named in royal inscriptions, the messengers. The treaty is not a magical object, it is a network. Someone carries copies. Someone confirms seals. Someone recites clauses in a foreign court, hoping their accent doesn't spark disrespect. Someone waits outside an audience chamber while nobles argue about a single word, aid, help, with all strength, and that word might decide whether troops march when the third-party threat arrives. Diplomacy is slow violence prevented by fast legs. And those clauses about mutual aid, let's dwell there, because they are the pulse of the treaty. If a third party attacks, the other shall help. That is a recognition that the map is not a two-player game. It is also a recognition that ideology cannot feed an army. When a new power rises, old rivals can become reluctant partners. This pattern is not ancient trivia. It is a recurring design in international politics. Yesterday's enemy becomes today's firewall. So, what did it cost to get to that recognition? It cost men and horses at Kadesh. It cost grain and bronze. It cost border villages that never appear in the treaty text but appear in ashes in the archaeological record. It cost reputations. Ramesses must rewrite near disaster as divine triumph. Hattusili must secure foreign validation against domestic suspicion. And it cost something subtler. It cost the purity of the victory myth. Once you sign a symmetrical treaty, you admit, quietly, bureaucratically, that the other side is your equal enough to negotiate with. Now, I want to place the two physical forms of the treaty in your hands again, because they teach you how power speaks. Imagine the clay tablet, small enough to hold, dense, private, meant for trained eyes. Imagine the temple inscription, huge, public, sacred space, meant for a nation to absorb as atmosphere. One says, we have an agreement you must follow. The other says, we are the kind of kingdom that makes the world sign agreements with us. Here's another question, which is more honest? It's a trap question. Honesty is not the axis here, function is. The archive copy functions as governance. The temple copy functions as legitimacy. Both are necessary because empires are machines with two engines, one runs on administration, the other on belief. At this point, you might be wondering whether the treaty worked. In the short term, it appears to have stabilized relations, or at least reduced the likelihood of major war between these two powers. But let's be careful, the Bronze Age does not hand out long-term guarantees. The very world that produced this treaty is approaching an era of upheaval, shifting powers, systemic stresses, and eventual collapses that will redraw the Eastern Mediterranean. That doesn't make the treaty meaningless. It makes it more revealing. Because even sophisticated diplomatic technology cannot fully protect a world built on fragile logistics and contested legitimacy. So what is the blueprint beneath the chaos, the pattern you can recognize in yourself and in our world? Overconfidence at the edge of imperfect information. Innovation under pressure, turning diplomacy into an engineered system of clauses. Moral compromise, extradition clauses, and mercy language bundled together. Coalition politics, vassals as the pressure points that force superpowers to behave. And narrative control, public victory stories running parallel to internal risk management. Let's drag that pattern into the present, because ancient history is not an anecdote, it is a force still acting upon us. We still live in a world of dual-track messaging, public-facing confidence versus internal documents that quietly admit parity, risk, and fear. Press releases and speeches on one side, classified briefings and closed-door memos on the other. We still build treaty architectures that look eerily familiar: non-aggression, mutual defense, extradition, verification by shared higher authorities, today, international law, institutions, economic dependence, surveillance, inspections. We still see border politics as the tripwire, local allies and client states are where great power rivalry becomes human crisis. And we still see escalation control as a desperate invention after a brush with disaster, misinformation, reconnaissance failure, fast-moving forces dragging leaders to the edge, then forcing them to build an off-ramp. There is a replica of the Kadesh Treaty hanging at the United Nations. Not because it's quaint. Because it is a warning in two languages: peace is often signed not when hearts change, but when ledgers, logistics, and legitimacy break. The question that should bother you is not, did they mean it? The question is, what does it take, in our world, before superpowers are forced to write the future instead of trying to conquer it? Here is my verdict, pulled from clay and carved stone and the quiet panic between them. Kadesh teaches a blunt rule: when victory is too expensive and defeat is too dangerous, states sign peace that is really a technology, an instrument to manage uncertainty, control allies, and stabilize legitimacy. The treaty is not the opposite of war. It is war translated into administration, enforced by reputation, sanctified by whatever higher authority people fear enough to obey. And once you see that, you start noticing how often we do the same thing. We don't stop competing, we redesign the arena. We don't stop fighting, we outsource the fight to rules, institutions, paperwork, and public narratives that make compromise feel like strength. Sometimes that saves lives. Sometimes it freezes injustice in place. Often it does both at once, because humans are capable of building stability out of fear and calling it virtue. Join the investigation. If you want more cases like this, where we cross-examine artifacts, propaganda, and human motives until the past starts to feel uncomfortably present, subscribe to Archives of Humanity. It tells the algorithm you want long-form historical detective work, and it helps this channel keep building episodes that don't just recount events, but interrogate them. And when the end screen appears, choose the next video waiting there, keep the session going, because the next case file will sharpen this one in your mind. Now the legacy question, the one you can't Google, the one that puts you in the moral crossroads of that archive room. If you were the scribe pressing those wedges into clay, and you knew the treaty would return fugitives to the hands of kings, but might also prevent thousands from dying in the next campaign, would you deepen the sign, make the clause unmistakable, and help it endure? Or would you let ambiguity creep in, one soft wedge, one uncertain mark, so that mercy has somewhere to hide later?